You with us for today's panel discussion on mobilizing young voters in 2020 and beyond. This event is co-sponsored by UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies and the Berkeley Institute for Young Americans. I'm Sarah Anzia, Associate Professor of Public Policy and Political Science and Faculty Director of the Institute for Young Americans. It's been a pleasure to work with the co-directors of IGS, Christina Mora and Eric Schickler, to bring together a group of really terrific panelists to talk to us about the political participation of young people. We all hear a lot about how young adults turn out to vote at a much lower rate than their older counterparts. And it's quite likely that their low turnout has real consequences for public policy. Millennials and Gen Z are the most diverse generations in American history, and they also have different policy priorities and preferences than their older counterparts. So what explains the lower voting rates of young Americans? What are the most effective strategies for mobilizing young people? And in what ways can the increased mobilization of the highly diverse younger generation reshape American politics? Finding answers to these questions is right at the heart of the mission of the Berkeley Institute of Young Americans, which is focused on how to make public policy sustainable and fair across generations. And it's also central to the goals and mission of IGS. Today's event, focused on youth turnout, is IGS's third and final event in what has been a fantastic series on the 2020 election and the future of American democracy. With that, I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's panel, Elizabeth Jarvis Sheen. Liz is Vice President of Communications and Policy at DoorDash. Before joining DoorDash, she oversaw the global public affairs and corporate communications team at Airbnb and managed communications for a number of other pioneering companies. She also helped to shape key communications and research elements of both of Barack Obama's campaigns. And perhaps most importantly, she's the graduate of the Political Science Department of the University of California, Berkeley, a longtime member of the IGS community, and a member of the Matsui Center on Politics Advisory Committee. So those in the audience who would like to pose questions to the panelists, please put your questions in the Q&A for Liz. And with that, Liz, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, everybody, for putting on an incredible three-day event here. I am honored to get to moderate this panel. As Sarah said, I am a proud Bear. I'm actually fifth generation Berkeley. So anytime I have an opportunity to come and participate in the Cal community, it is a welcome one, and particularly something as important as elections and those who participate in it, and how do we increase that participation. I am lucky to be joined by three folks who are far more expert than I in the topics that Sarah outlined. So let me introduce them briefly, and then I will turn it over to each of them to give a quick presentation and some initial thoughts on the turnout for young voters and what are some of the drivers and what can we think about understanding election results and for the future. So first is Professor Sunshine Hillegas. She is a professor of political science at Duke University. She has published incredibly widely on the topics of American political behavior, campaigns and elections, my favorite topic, survey methods, public opinion, information technology, and politics. And that intersection is so important, particularly for this cohort. She's the co-author of Making Young Voters, she's also the co-author of The Persuadable Voter, Wedge Issues in Political Campaigns, and The Hard Count, The Social and Political Challenges of the 2020 Census, all the more relevant as we find ourselves in a year divisible by 10. She is the director of the Duke Initiative on Survey Methodology. She's the co-director of the Polarization Lab as well. And from 2003 to 2009, she taught at Harvard, where she was the Frederick S. Danziger Associate Professor of Government and the founding director of the Program on Survey Research. Sunshine, I'm just going to run through real quickly and then we'll turn it over to you. Our next panelist is Ben Wessel, a fellow Obama alumni. So excited to have Ben here. He is the executive director of Next Gen America, which is an organization dedicated to mobilizing young voters across the United States. So has a few things to share with us as to the successes they had, in particular this cycle. In this role, he is working to elect candidates who support progressive policies with a focus on mobilizing the voters who care most about those issues, so young people. Next Gen Rising worked across 10 states, focusing on elections from the presidential down to the state legislature. And in 2016, Ben was named one of the 16 young Americans shaping the 2016 election by Rolling Stone. Before that, he worked on Cory Booker's campaign for the US Senate, probably with my friend Adisu. He was the political campaigns manager for 350.org Action, and as the youth director, or the youth vote director, I beg your pardon, for the 2012 re-elect, where we got to work together in New Hampshire. He has been working on youth climate movement, so that has taken him from a Russian research vessel in the Norwegian Arctic to the halls of Congress and state capitals around the country, sometimes with possibly as chilly a reception. He is a board member of the Alliance for Youth Action and a native of the District of Columbia, which we will not hold against him. And then our final panelist is Professor Veronica Terriquez. She is an associate professor of sociology at University of California, Santa Cruz. Go Banana Slugs. She received her PhD in sociology at UCLA, her master's in education at Berkeley, go Bears, and her BA in sociology at Harvard. Her research in particular focuses on youth transitions to adulthood, civic engagement, social inequality, and immigrant integration. She is the principal investigator of the California Young Adult Study, Youth Leadership and Health Study, and the Young Voter Engagement Study. So very much looking forward to the perspective in particular on youth voting and patterns and turnout here in California with, I think, a special focus in Los Angeles. So very excited to hear that. Informed by over 2 decades of connections to social justice movements here in the state, much of her research has implications for policies that affect low-income communities of color across the country. So I am thrilled to have the 3 of you here. Thank you all for taking the time. And with that, Sunshine, let me turn it over to you for your headline remarks.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and especially the opportunity to talk about my book, which came out in February right before the world shut down and nobody wanted to talk about young voters. With only 10 minutes to talk, I want to organize my thoughts around 3 points. First, the scope of the youth turnout problem. Second, explanations for why there are low levels of turnout. And finally, implications now that the election is over on where we go from here. In starting with the problem, I feel like a little bit of a curmudgeon because I think there is a lot to celebrate from this election cycle. But I want to keep in mind that I think turnout, we're going to see that turnout is ultimately up among the entire electorate. And so the fundamental problem that brought us here today, I think, is going to show that we still have a ways to go. And let me just give you some historical context for that problem. What we have seen through time, whether you're talking about, this historic turnout in 2018 or what we might see in 2020 or going back, is that there is a consistent and enormous gap in turnout between young Americans and older Americans. And it is roughly about a turnout rate of twice the size. It's even larger if you look only at local elections. And even when we look at that historic turnout rate that we have heard so much about in 2018, we see that the gap is still there. And we're talking about an increase from about 21% turnout rate of young people in 2014 to a little over 30% in 2018. So 2/3 of young people still stayed home. To give you some additional context, that gap between old and young people is larger than what we find when we look at gaps by race and ethnicity or education or socioeconomic status. So it's also one of the worst in the world. And I'm not advancing. There we go. So we looked at the CSES, the latest CSES, to look at recent election cycles. And what we find is the United States is worse than 34 advanced democracies in the study. And this matters. It matters for who gets elected and the policies that get implemented. Okay, so that's the problem. So what's the explanation? And what we argue in the book is that the explanation has largely been misdiagnosed. The conventional wisdom is that young people are apathetic and disinterested. They're turned off by polarization, that millennials are self-absorbed and taking selfies instead of trying to impact politics. Of course, we know by looking around that simply isn't true. But the reality is that was not true in 2020. It was not true in 2018. And it hasn't been true for a very, very long time. So looking across just the last 5 election cycles, 85% of 18 to 29-year-olds say they're interested in politics, and 81% said they intend to vote when asked before the election. So the problem is not about the precursors, the civic attitudes that underline turnout. Rather, the problem is about follow through. So there is a gap between young people saying that they plan to vote and then their actual turnout behavior. So again, the problem is not disinterest. It is about following through on that interest, their civic attitudes, and their intentions. And that gap is much larger for young people than for older Americans. What we think that this is really like focusing on this gap between turnout intention and turnout offers like a new way to think about the problem and leads us to some different policy solutions. So if we think about why it is that young people might not follow through on their civic attitudes, what we identify are a set of personal and institutional hurdles that can sometimes get in the way. Personally, young people are more mobile and less settled, and there's lots of reasons to think about the increased difficulty of making it to a polling place on the first Tuesday in November compared to someone who has a very stable 9-to-5 job and kind of look out and plan more easily. But institutionally, there are also a lot of rules about when, where, and how Americans can vote that vary across time, that vary across states, and these disproportionately affect young and new voters. In the book, we talk a lot about both of these things. We talk about how that link between civic attitudes and behaviors is not that different from setting other behavioral goals in which intentions can be outsized relative to behaviors, whether it's plans to exercise or eat healthy or study for an exam. It turns out that the people who are most likely to follow through on their intentions to vote are people who have what are called non-cognitive skills. These are competencies related to self-regulation and effortfulness and interpersonal interactions. And that helps to enable young people to persevere when they encounter obstacles, distractions, and diversions. But the thing that I think is most relevant for our conversation today is the fact that it takes these set of skills, this perseverance, to be able to actually vote in the United States if you're a young person. And again, I think when we think about the policy solutions then, that it's not about kind of telling young people to kind of learn how to persevere in order to vote. It's what can we do to make the costs of voting lower so that young people are more likely to participate. So let me first, in switching to those solutions, first tell you what I think is not the answer. I think it is not the answer to just focus on trying to increase interest in the election, trying to make voting cool. Young people are already interested. They already think there was a lot at stake in the election. We have to focus on that failure to follow through on that interest. And so what that means is that the real solution really comes between elections. It is not about any one campaign and what gets done, even if there are some terrific mobilization efforts that do get underway. What we need to do is make registration and voting easier. These are the laws that are governing and create barriers for young people to participate. So in the book, we look at things like pre-registration and same-day registration and online registration, automatic voter registration. In addition, registration within high schools. These are all things that we consider in the book, and I think are an important piece of the story, particularly when we think about why it is the US is different from other countries. The other thing that we need to do is rethink civics education. The current civics curriculum is something that's really focused on memorizing facts and figures about government and history, what we call bubble sheet civics, right? Where you are focused on increasing knowledge, but not necessarily the mechanics of what it takes to actually register and vote. And there's a lot of people who have focused on civics education, and the point we make is it's not just that there has been a decline in the amount of civics over time, although that certainly has been the case. It's about the fact that we're not teaching the right information. Schools need to talk about current politics, and right now teachers are terrified to do that because of what it means to navigate these very polarized topics. We need the schools to actually be involved in helping to register young people. It's not a matter, and it's not enough to just put up a table in the cafeteria to have a registration drive. Students actually need instruction and insistence in completing registration forms. And then finally, the point I would make is just that civic education should help to clear up some of the misperceptions that are out there about the voting process and the informational requirements for being a good voter. One of the themes that we found in the book that I'm now working on is the fact that in qualitative interviews, we frequently heard young people say that they didn't feel well informed enough to vote, despite intentions and despite interest, and that they planned to do more research about the candidates and the issues, but ultimately didn't feel like they were informed enough to vote, and they didn't want to just vote for a party. They, it turns out, hold much more negative views about voting for just a single party. So what we find is that there are these informational misperceptions about what it takes to be a good voters, as evidenced by one poll that just found that young people were much less likely than older people to say that all eligible American citizens should vote, even if they're not well informed about the election. So let me conclude again. I guess the point that I want to emphasize here is that there is a lot to celebrate from this election cycle, but there is a lot still left to do. And I think the most effective policy solutions are ones that are going to come in between election cycles. And I will stop there.
Thank you for that. We've already got questions popping up, so excited to get to those in the Q&A. And very excited to also take some of what you shared and start engaging with Ben and others who've been on the ground and hear about that. So Ben, let me turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thanks a ton, Liz. And I will plug that us practitioners also read the academic literature.
I love it.
I may not have gone to Cal, but I'm still smart. Well, good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to share my screen real quick. It is super great to be with everyone here. And I'm going to try and tell folks what just happened because I'm a partisan hack and I spent a lot of my time working on this election. And so I can't wait to share what we think happened with y'all and a little bit about NextGen, the organization that I run, and the role that we think we played. So the short version is, wow, a lot just happened. When it comes to turnout, young people showed up to vote, we think, in record numbers for the second election in a row. Just like 2018 broke records, we think 2020 did as well. Of course, it's not just about how you show up, it's who you support. And young people supported Joe Biden by nearly a 2-to-1 margin, a huge difference maker, especially when we look at just 4 years ago in the Clinton-Trump election. And then because I'm good at my job, I'm going to brag about the work that my team did. We ran the largest program ever focused on young voters, and we really think we helped put Joe Biden over the top and created something special that will be really important for years to come. So, turnout. First and foremost, these are estimates because we don't have all of the formal data back, but I never got a PhD, so I don't have to be constrained, I think, by everyone else on this call. The exit polls in the AP Votecast suggest that young voters, those 18 to 29, were about 17% of all people who cast ballots. That's up 1 point from 2016, but in a year where everyone was fired up, that's a really big deal. Circle, which is a great research institute at Tufts that looks at a lot of this young voter work, they estimate that turnout from young voters was somewhere between 53 and 56%. That is record breaking. And most interestingly, in a year where turnout was really up for everyone, we think that young people increased their turnout over 4 years ago more than older folks. So I've got a table, again, estimates, we got ranges and all that stuff, but it seems all ages bumped up their turnout about 6 points, which means young people was probably up about 7 to 10 points. Really exciting stuff for those of us who live and breathe this work. I say highest youth vote turnout ever. There's probably all sorts of caveats and end notes I should put here. But when you look, these are presidential elections since 1986. Even if you take the low end of the estimate from Circle, where it would be 53% turnout, that would break records. You know, we could have fights about 1972 and when we lowered the voting age and all that jazz, but it's very clear to me that this was super high turnout from young people. And we heard that for the whole year, all talking to young people, that a level of interest and also potential follow through was likely to be higher than ever. It's important to note that I think a lot of this has to do with outreach. You know, there's a ton that we have to do between election cycles, but we know that during election cycles, the more likely you are to be communicated with, the more likely you are to show up. And so NextGen, which runs program across 11 key battleground states and reaches out to sort of sporadic voting or low turnout young people, we saw in our surveys that we were running through normal polling, but also through some of the online questionnaires we were doing, that young people were steadily increasing their likelihood to vote as the year went on. This number sort of matches up with some of what you just saw from Sunshine. And we know that we were targeting people who were not super keen on the election period, and we got them to increase how motivated they say they were to vote. But beyond just turnout, I think it's important to recognize that these young people are really breaking hard for Democrats and progressive candidates. So again, based on the exits, it looks like young people supported Joe Biden about 61 to 36. This is a big increase over 4 years ago, and puts us about in line with Obama 2012. So good work to Liz and me that year. Not quite to 2008 levels, but hey, we did our best. Most importantly, and you know, there's a million ways to skin the electoral cat, but it really does look like young voters and increased youth enthusiasm, turnout, but also breaking hard for Biden really helped Joe Biden win in some of these key states, especially the Arizonas, the Georgias, the places that were very tight margins that were newly blue for the first time in a generation on the Electoral College map. So you can see the net votes that came from 18 to 29-year-olds, a really overwhelming, you know, hundreds of thousands of net youth votes for Biden, far more than the margin. So yeah, we'll take credit for that. Thanks. You're welcome, Joe Biden. Youth vote put you in the White House. I think a big story that we need to remember, you know, just a little historical context, like in the year 2000, young voters split about 50-50 between Al Gore and George W. Bush. This is a hugely different group of young people now, and they are staying progressive year after year. Gen Z and millennials are the largest, most diverse generations, but also the most progressive. One of the things that I think is most exciting is that Hillary Clinton, unfortunately, had lower margins than she needed amongst young people in order to win, in part because of third-party candidates. But Joe Biden brought those folks back in. We see in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, Biden's margin of victory with young people, even though Hillary won these folks, Biden's margin was, you know, double-digit points, and that translates into tens of thousands of votes. I think a lot of people will call me on my math here, so I'm not going to dig into the numbers because these are all estimates. But we do know that young people were the sort of changers in this election. You know, we, at the end of the Democratic primary, we were talking to the key voters that we work with, and it was very clear that they didn't have a favorable opinion of Joe Biden. All they knew was he was old. All they knew was that he was like an old white dude. They were excited about different candidates, including some old white dudes. But we left the primary, and you can see this is from a CNN poll in May, where young people had a negative 22 favorable rating for the Biden ticket. Fast forward just 5 months, and that has swung to a positive plus 23 rating, whereas all other ages stayed nearly flat. So nearly all of Biden's increased favorability ratings throughout the whole campaign and the billions of dollars that were spent really came from young people who had an oppositional viewpoint coming around and saying, okay, Joe Biden is the kind of guy that we want in the White House. I think that's particularly important because third parties were a huge problem for Democrats with young voters in 2016 2016. This year, it looks like only 3% of young people probably voted third party compared to about 1 in 10 in 2016. This is a screenshot from some of NextGen's polling. And you can really see this was a concentrated effort to get people to like Joe Biden more and have a more favorable opinion and drop down on their support for third party candidates. Lots of freaking out about Kanye West in the press. Turns out just totally to be a non-issue, which was great. So let me just brag on my team a little bit. NextGen, we ran our largest program ever. Biden won 8 of the 11 states where we were doing work. And we really think we had to both persuade people to support Biden as well as create turnout, right? Like Sunshine was saying, it's really hard to create new voters and motivate people to cast a ballot. Oftentimes folks focus on young people and they think of them just as turnout voters. We know that you have to persuade and turn out. Give a little detail. Oh, just for context, we ran a really big thing. We're basically a youth vote super PAC. We spent almost $60 million this year. 22,000 volunteers is probably the number I'm most excited about here. Folks who are calling, texting, DMing, having those conversations about vote intention and making sure that people are well informed about who's on their ballot. We sent voter guides to 6.5 million people. We reached digital ads to 6.5 million people. It was really big. That's the moral of the story. And we think it worked. So we were running randomized controlled trials the whole time to figure out what we were doing and whether it was working. We saw those who saw our digital ads in our top 6 battleground states had a higher likelihood to say they were going to vote for Joe Biden. They liked him more than a control group. That's what that blue line is. We think that really mattered in some of these states where we're looking at tens of thousands of votes being the margin of victory. And I'll end with this, which is there's a lot of young people out there, right? Gen Z and millennials are about 40% of the eligible electorate. And that means that we only need to have little ticks up in turnout to make a giant difference, or little ticks up in support in order to make a giant difference. That's why last time Trump got 306 electoral college votes, this time Biden got 306. It's those little marginal changes. We focused on an audience of low turnout progressives, people who are very unlikely to vote. And these are oftentimes people who had never voted before, some of whom hadn't even ever registered to vote before. And we went after these folks hard for about a year, calling, texting, sending mail, making sure their friends were communicating with them. And at the end of the day, we can actually track how many of them were able to cast a ballot early via mail already. And then when you look in some of these key states, it may be like Pennsylvania, only 10% of these low turnout progressives actually voted early. And that number will go up when we have the election day data. But just that little 10% is a huge ramification for the outcome of the election, right? 67,000 votes from those young, low turnout progressives, far more than Biden's margin of victory. So we're pretty proud of what we did. You can check it all out on our website and hit me up on Twitter, but we will hopefully answer your questions during the Q&A. Thanks.
Like a true organizer, closing with the follow-up with more information here. I love that. Thank you, Ben. Would love to turn it over to Veronica now to talk to us about some of the lessons learned, particularly out of Los Angeles.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure and honor to follow Dr. Hillegas and Mr. Wessel. I think my presentation nicely complements the 2 previous presentations. I'm going to talk about a case study of the Los Angeles youth vote, which I think offers a lot of lessons learned for maintaining and continued increases in voter turnout among young people, particularly first-time voters. So for those of you who are not familiar with LA County, it's a huge county. 80% of the young residents aged 18 to 24 are young people of color. Many of them are low income, and many of them are the children of immigrants. And usually we know that low income youth particularly those from immigrant backgrounds, tend to turn out at much lower rates, in part because their parents may not be eligible to vote, or they're new voters, and parents may also encounter language barriers to voting. And this contributes to the lack of information in many households about elections. So, as with other parts of the country, LA had a high voter turnout among young people this election cycle. However, this election cycle is unique. We've got to remember that there were a lot of forces mobilizing young people, including Next Gen, including community organizations across the country, including the popular media. And yes, some were mobilized to support Joe Biden, and others were mobilized in opposition to Trump or in support of Trump. And so this was a contentious election, and we tend to see higher turnouts during contentious elections. As Professor Hillegas had mentioned, we tend to see lower turnouts during midterm elections and also in off-year elections. And so this is why it's really important to maintain young voter education and engagement in between election cycles. And a lot of community organizations in California and in other states like Arizona and Florida have really been developing this model called integrated voter engagement, where grassroots community organizing groups, youth organizing groups, maintain communication with their constituents, engage them in local community efforts, and involve them in ongoing voter education and registration. And lessons learned from LA in particular, this helps maintain voter engagement and continues engaging an emerging electorate. So let me just show you what the turnout looked like between two midterm elections in Los Angeles County. So in 2014, under 7% of young voters turned out for the midterm election in LA County. By 2018, this had quadrupled. And this, of course, in part had to do because people felt strongly about the Trump administration on either way. But there was ongoing voter education and outreach starting in 2015. There was an initiative called the LA Youth Vote that was started by the United Way in collaboration with LA Unified School District, and it spread to community-based organizations, a grassroots youth organizing group, voter mobilization group called Power California took it up and started training young people in high schools and community organizations not only to do the voter registration, but to do the education. The education entailed ongoing training for young people, high school age in particular, on the election process and why voting is important. One of the things that they reminded young people, and the young people spread this information like wildfire, was that young people remain underrepresented in the electorate, particularly young people of color, and that their voices were not being heard. And the young people showed some of the stats that Professor Hillegas shared with us about this age gap, and they used that as a mobilizing tool. In addition to that, young people were trained to do pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, because we could do that in California, and register other young people who were age eligible. And so there was an army of young people trained to register their peers and to share the message of why voting is important. And one of the things that they did too was engage young people, including young people who were not citizens, in doing peer-to-peer outreach and mobilization during the elections. So during this nonpartisan outreach, they would talk about why voting mattered to them, how as either immigrants or the children of immigrants, or as a Black youth, or as an Asian American youth, voting was important to them. And they made sure to outreach to people in their own communities so they could personalize the message. In addition to that, they did social media outreach. And similar to the experiments that Ben showed us, this approach helped increase turnout by a significant margin. So in the 2018 election, which I tracked very closely, if a young person reached out to another young voter age 18 to 24, they were over 5% more likely to vote. And so this peer-to-peer outreach was particularly powerful, and the nonpartisan messaging worked. And so in LA, we had this really coordinated effort that engaged young people in getting out the vote. And in my research, I found that this army of young people became increasingly interested in elections, and many were excited to continue to get out the vote in years to come. So this was developing the leadership capacity among, in particular, low-income young people of color, many of them from immigrant backgrounds, who remained committed to getting out the vote in their own communities. And it wasn't just for the midterm election. Many of them also were interested in local elections and also the statewide elections. So one of the things that really worked well in Los Angeles that I did not find in my research across the state, necessarily find in my research across the state, that I think offers important lessons for initiatives that are trying to get the vote out, is that coordination can really help make a difference. In LA, we saw at least 9 youth organizing groups really coordinating and dividing up turfs so that they made sure that they could reach the maximum number of young people in doing their voter education and outreach. In addition, they work closely with the county registrar of voters to help gain access to the voter registration cards. And this was important because I also observed voter outreach efforts in other parts of the state where the county registrar was very skeptical about giving young people registration cards. They didn't trust them, especially if they were 16 or 17-year-olds. Here in LA, there was this trust that was developed, and sometimes the county registrar staff would come out and do voter registration with the young people to add an extra layer of legitimacy. Because when you got 15 and 16-year-olds doing voter registration, sometimes people question their ability to do so, even though they can be quite competent in doing voter outreach. And then in addition, the young people themselves coordinated with their school administrators, their teachers, and in the school district to kind of make sure that they could have access to classroom space, or sometimes young people organized school-wide assemblies where they registered and educated hundreds of young people at a time. And really it's got them excited about getting out the vote in a nonpartisan way. So we're doing this in high school, they were doing this in high schools, and it has to be nonpartisan. But I also believe that it's an important site that allows for the development of critical thinking and for young people to learn how to continue doing research so that they can vote in ways that benefit their communities and their interests. Now, given the significant success of the LA County youth vote in particular back in 2018, there was still room for growth, a growth that Professor Hillegas had alluded to. For every 100 young people that were eligible to vote, only 66 were registered and 29 voted. I know this proportion has improved since the last election because of this really contentious presidential election. But I think it's important to continue doing this voter education and outreach because we know in other off-year elections, young people do not engage. So the ongoing education and the peer-to-peer outreach seems to be a particularly powerful tool. And I find this to be the case in low-income communities of color. So thank you for allowing me to share this research.
Thank you for sharing it. This is fantastic. So we have a ton of questions coming in. I already have a bunch of my own. So I'd love to start with, given that we in some ways feel like we're still in the election cycle, setting aside my friends on transition who are in fact hard at work. I'd love to hear a little bit about, whether it was Tuesday night or Wednesday morning, as the data began to come in, as you started to see patterns and results, did what happened in 2020, particularly with the youth vote, was it what you were expecting? Was it a surprise? Did we not have enough data early enough to sort of make some of those assessments? Maybe Ben, I'll start with you and then would love to open it up to the others.
Sure. Well, I'm an optimist. You have to be an optimist to be an organizer. So I knew we were going to break records. I knew that everyone was going to break hard for progressive candidates. But I will say I wasn't surprised at all. And one of the things that is really interesting about the selection cycle was the increased availability of voting by mail and the relaxing of rules about who can vote early and when and where and how. And not only did that give us more data to say, holy smokes, this is likely to happen, we're going to see some of this record-breaking turnout, it's also the impact of like a lot of the recommendations that are coming out of these great academics literature about expanding access to the ballot actually increases participation. And so it's so interesting, you can kind of close your eyes and guess which states are going to have the highest youth turnout just based on their voting laws. And so it's interesting to me that as we saw more adaptation of more flexibility on how to vote, we knew that young people were going to show up. But I was terrified Tuesday night because that's what Democrats do. We worry. But then
I believe one of our old bosses used to call us bedwetters.
Amen. And when you add all my like Jewish anxiety and guilt on top of that, it's just overwhelming. But by Wednesday morning, I was feeling very confident, and I'm glad we got to where we needed to be.
Yeah. Veronica, did you see what you had expected in Los Angeles in particular?
Yes, I mean, there was so much work to get out the vote. I think I was not surprised.
So what I will say that I was, again, a little bit more concerned about some of the barriers, and I still think there's going to be a lot to learn about some of that variation across states. I mean, 300 some lawsuits about the particular electoral rules, that there is no doubt in my mind that on the one hand that created some confusion. At the same time, there was this very effective message in places like Texas and Georgia that I think that there was a backlash, and we have seen that, say, with voter ID type laws, where that becomes a mobilizing force to say there were policies there were attempts to suppress your vote. Let's go the extra mile. What I worry about, right, is that there was a target this time around to change the regime, but that's very different from what is my focus, which is we need to increase youth turnout, and we need to be able to increase youth turnout, not just in an election when people think that, democracy is at stake, but also in the next election cycle, particularly in midterms. And there we still have a lot to do. And returning to a little bit of a theme that I ended on, and that is that while there's no doubt that young people did not like Trump and that they improved their opinions of Biden, there is still this real resistance to calling themselves loyal Democrats, right? And to voting straight ticket, and to saying that the reason that they're voting is because they want to support one party or over the other. And again, I think that's partly a reaction to the polarized political environment. And I think we have a lot of work to do, particularly for a lower information midterm election in which people won't have as clear signals about how they should be voting just based on how they're living their lives. And so I think we're going to have a big challenge ahead in the midterm.
No, it's so that touches on a question that's come up in a couple of different flavors from the audience, and would love Ben or whomever to jump in first, but particularly this election. So maybe stay with this election for a moment, and then we can move into sort of the look ahead. But were you finding, in terms of organizing, registering, and mobilizing young voters, was the president the driving factor, or was it a more issue-based thing, or did it not get that differentiated? It was the issue I care about where I disagree with this individual.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab. I'm curious to hear what other folks have to say as well. For us, Trump put this potential on the map, right? And it's not so much that young people who are very progressive were so disgusted by Donald Trump, but it's that politics was in the ether in a way that it isn't normally, right? And that was true in the midterms as well. And so we saw level of engagement and peer accountability that we strive for as organizers happening automatically, right? You couldn't escape the fact that your town or city or county was shut down because of COVID or whatever the latest thing that Trump was saying. That would create some buzz within your own community without someone who's getting paid to try to communicate with you trying to say this stuff. And so the fact that Trump made all this stuff really top of mind totally helped. I don't think that the necessary outcome of that was always going to be super high turnout. It just created conditions to make that happen. I think all the protest movements and social movements we're seeing activating also help put that on the table. And the fact that everybody pointed to voting as a really good way to take action really helped us get to where we were last week.
Yeah, Veronica or Sunshine?
Well, I think in California, young people, particularly young people of color, were motivated by the issues. They were motivated by their support for movement for Black lives. They were motivated by their concerns around COVID, and they were motivated by Trump's immigration policies and opposition to them. And so for them, it really was the issues that helped drive them to the polls. In addition to that, in California, there were some propositions that had very important implications for low-income folks and folks of color, young voters. And so that also helped to increase turnout.
You know, Sunshine, you mentioned in your presentation a focus, or you had the slide with a few bullets, and in particular had the various types of registration. So pre-registration, same day, online, automatic, in school. How do you think about the importance of that versus, or maybe supplementary or complementary to, the increase in the different ways to then cast one's ballot once you're registered? Like, which are they? I would assume that they're both incredibly important drivers for youth vote registration and then turnout, but like, how do you think about those together?
So actually, I think particularly for new and young voters that expanding registration tends to be one of the biggest hurdles. So getting over that registration barrier is critical. One of my very favorite qualitative interviews from the book is talking to a young woman who, political science major, but didn't vote. And she said, it was I missed the registration deadline, and it's a real shift in mindset. I'm used to be able to go on Amazon and I get the thing that I order the next day, and I was supposed to register 30 days in advance, right? Like that's such a different, thought process. And one of the things that I think is still where we need to be fighting and putting effort is, you look at a state like Texas and you have to both be registered 30 days in advance, and you can't register until you're 17 years and, half, almost 18. That gives such a small window for those youngest newly eligible individuals that I don't see how we don't consider that anything other than like a different opportunity to be able to participate. And I hope that there's some election lawyers that are going to be focusing on that, because there's a number of states where these rules really are putting massive barriers in place for participation. And that's kind of separate from, the very deliberate efforts by like the state of Florida to kick precincts off of colleges, the state of New Hampshire, which said that if you register to vote in the state, you have 30 days to then get your driver's license. That these are the type of things that I think it's very important that we stay focused on in between the mobilizing over candidates and issues that happen around an election cycle.
Veronica would love your thoughts on that.
Right. I agree. And I think one important intervention is to start doing this type of education at the secondary school level so that young people understand what process they have to go through and all the hoops that they have to jump through to be able to register and vote. The other thing that I think is really important for high school age students is to understand the importance of local elections. And in my research, I found that understanding that your school board member could be elected with just 500 votes is really motivating, because I've done these interviews where young people say, oh, it just takes 500 votes to get somebody to win. I know 500 people, right? There's more than 500 people on my social media. So this type of education can be really inspiring. And I think the earlier we start, the better, so that young people, when they are age eligible to vote, are ready and informed, and they understand the different levels of government. Because as Professor Hilligus mentioned earlier, it's confusing. There's a lot of information to take in. What is a water district, for example? What do they do? So that type of information is critical. Additionally, I think we should be looking at a recent victory in Oakland, Measure QQ passed, where young people went out and convinced voters that they should be allowed to vote at age 16 for school board elections. And I think it's going to create the opportunity to bring to life the civics education at the high school level in a nonpartisan way that could start engaging adolescents in the electoral process and give them the space to kind of learn about voting. And I really hope that other parts of the country learn from the Oakland experience.
I love that. And, I know that you've written, for example, your research has consistently shown that people respond better to appeals from peers who look like them and talk like them. They're responsive to members of their community. I think, that's exactly what you're talking about there. Ben, I'd love to hear, how does that kind of insight inform what you all at NextGen are doing on the ground, or digitally, since we live in the COVID era? And
the virtual ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. That finding in the academic literature bears out in practice out in the field. We know that when young people are hearing from folks who think, talk, act, smell, look like them, that's how you're going to be able to get best response. And even more important, someone that they know, right? A neighbor, a friend, a parent, all that peer pressure. Like, we know that social pressure saying all of your friends are voting, so you should vote too. That's like one of the most compelling things we can do. The challenge with young people has always been, all your friends aren't voting. Like, one of your 5 friends is the weird guy who votes, and everyone else is like, I don't care, whatever. And so success begets success here, where we're creating that community feel of, wow, this is something that we all do and we can do it together. One of the things that was so interesting for us this cycle, where normally we're on the ground, we usually have hundreds of organizers on campuses, knocking doors and housing projects, communicating with young people face to face. And like, you can answer questions in real time. You can hand them the form and say, make sure you fill out subsection D. We couldn't do that this year, and it was incredibly challenging. But some of the innovations that came from this moment, I think, are things that we'll put into practice moving forward. My favorite example, and it's like super buzzy, is the use of Instagram influencers, YouTubers, and TikTokers. These are people that you maybe...
Twitch now, man. That was my favorite, was Twitch, and like the gamification
totally
of voter registration. It was incredible.
Yeah, and one of the things that's great about it is you may not know that Twitch streamer, but you feel like you're friends because you put something in the chat and they might respond back. It's a sort of, parasocial relationship where we had influencers, everyone from drag queens in Orlando to dog and cat meme accounts in Madison, Wisconsin, to curly hair makeup enthusiasts in Arizona saying, hey guys, just want to tell you about how to vote this year. And like, that's the kind of peer conversation that we know we need to have, even though it felt like a broadcast conversation. It really I can't wait to get more data back about how effective that was, because I think it changes the game in a COVID time like this.
That's that. So then, and this is probably for any of the three of you. So thinking through that, election season is not over. We have 2 runoffs in Georgia. Any sense of, the learnings that have been derived from this most recent actual, big election that we then take into the runoff to mobilize youth voters, right? Like, youth turnout in Georgia was like the tipping point. And so would love to hear thoughts on that as we get into a pretty wild and exciting 2 months.
I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm willing to let other folks go first if you want. Cool.
Why don't you kick it off? And then we'll
interrupt me whenever. I know I'm a chatty guy. I mean, Georgia's for all the marbles, right? If we win both these races, we being Democrats, if we win both these Senate races, Kamala Harris is the deciding vote in the US Senate, and we can start to make progress again and again. Progress begets more progress. If when young people feel like, hey, we can actually do something about this stuff, we think they'll turn out at higher rates. Here's the deal in Georgia. The cards are stacked against us. Even though we think young people were about 21% of all voters in Georgia this year, the highest share of the electorate out of any of the states, there's still a lot of barriers to participation. One is that the election is on January 5th. People are not used to voting on January 5th. Students who may be registered and voted at their campuses on November 2nd, 3rd, God, I can't remember anymore. November 3rd, we're in the after times. They won't be at school. It'll be winter break, so they may have to re-register where they are now. We also know that we are targeting 500,000 young progressives who voted earlier absentee in the November election. They have to sign up to vote by mail all over again, and we only have a 2-month time period. And it's the holidays. Like, there are so many barriers that are being erected, either intentionally or not so much, that are going to make it harder for youth participation to succeed. But it wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't make a pitch. You can go to organizing.nextgenamerica.org. Phone banks start on Tuesday. We would love anyone's help just to get young people out to vote and get them to understand the ramifications of what an Ossoff or Warnock victory would really look like.
So thanks, Ben. I think you're doing some of the things that Power California has been doing here in California, really training young people to be spokespersons among their peers and enabling them to use their classrooms, their classroom ties to remind people to vote and to remind people to re-register. So young people really can be the conduits of information among their peers. And I think the more that that's done, the better. And really getting people excited and reminding them what the stakes are in the election will be really important.
So I guess I would just add that Georgia is going to be tricky. That comes at a time that is particularly difficult. There's also a question of, like, can the enthusiasm and effort that went into the November election be sustained? And I think that is a big challenge. And so, hats off to Ben and the others that are still part of the fight. I think that Georgia is, again, one of those states where it has incredibly restrictive and difficult laws to navigate. And so, there is going to be rampant amounts of confusing instructions for college students, for new people who want to get registered. And so, again, it's if you know any young people in Georgia, do reach out, because just because they're posting something political on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to translate at the ballot box on January 5th, because of all of these particular hurdles that they'll have to jump through to get to the ballot box.
Yeah, and talking about that, the in particular the young folks, and Veronica, you mentioned the measure in Oakland. Obviously, there's a ballot measure here in California, also about enabling those who are 17, essentially and a half, to register to vote in time. So once they become, all that. How are you thinking about, and what can the audience maybe be thinking about doing in terms of registration and civic participation in high schools? I think building that muscle, right, of civic participation and engagement, and an understanding of how to move the needle and why it's important.
Well, I think making exciting curriculum accessible to high school teachers is really important, and creating spaces for perhaps young people to lead that curriculum as well has really proven effective in places like Los Angeles and parts of the Central Valley, and in Oakland and other parts where Power California's curriculum has been implemented. And it really speaks to how voting impacts young people in that particular community. I think really tailoring the voter education and linking it to social issues works.
Yeah. Well, and Sunshine, I think you talked about, am I getting this right, the bubble curriculum, or?
Yeah. Right. So bubble sheet civics, so there is a lot that we do in terms of talking about how we need to really reimagine civic education. And part of that is focusing on the mechanics of voting, right? That rather than trying to memorize the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, we need to tell young people what it is if their rights are if they show up at the polling location and they don't see their name in the voter file. 50% of young people in one study screwed up their voter registration form in one way or another, forgetting a signature or not putting the full set of information in it. We know that young people are more likely to have to cast provisional ballots. We know that young people are more likely to have their mail-in ballots rejected. There is a lot just with respect to the mechanics of voting, and young people have admitted to the fact that, like, they're embarrassed by the fact that they are confused about some of these rules, absentee ballots. And it's no wonder, right? The difference between mail-in ballots and absentee ballots. Do you have to get it notarized? Well, if in some states, yes. Are you eligible if you just moved into a state, and, does it have implications? These are all things that create a lot of confusion, and that confusion reduces confidence that young people have in being able to vote, and then undermines the likelihood that they are going to actually show up. The other thing that I think is super important to think about, again, and I mentioned this before, but what it takes to vote, right? In part because we focus on political knowledge in these civics classes, right? And we're teaching all of these, old legal cases and so on, and it's not necessarily connected to politics today. People think that to be a good voter, you have to be fully informed on every single issue and every single candidate, the water district, the dog catcher, and everything else. And there's this real resistance to relying on party as a heuristic to help you vote. And I think we need to be much clearer about the fact that we are able to muddle through. We're in a two-party system. It's okay to, make a guess in the water district about who you vote for on the basis of party label, that's an okay decision rule, and that you are still voting rationally, because particularly for these lower down the ballot races, that the lack of confidence that young voters have in their ability to be a good voter is something that we need to figure out in the education system how to directly confront. And it's not just a matter of throwing more information at them, right? And throwing more facts and figures and more legal cases. This is something, because that gap between old people and young people, older people, by God, they show up. They don't need to know every single candidate down the ballot. They know you need to show up, right? And we need that message that young people just need to show up, that's being a good citizen. That the amount of information that you bring to bear in making a choice once you get there is the least important part of the process.
And I'll just chime in super quick on this. One of the things that was so interesting about this 2020 election cycle was so many young people were voting by mail for the first time, which means they had their ballot in their hands way earlier than they normally do. Because normally they show up to the polling place, they fill out the top, they're like, I don't know, screw this other stuff. We were having conversations over the course of weeks, text messages between volunteers and voters where, first we were like, hey, did you get your ballot? And they were like, sure did, I'll get to it later. And then we're like, okay, it's 3 days later. Are you going to go vote now? Oh, I don't know, I'm busy. And then we'd get, seriously, 2 weeks after the first text message, we'd get, hey, what's the deal with the state Supreme Court election? And our organizers and our volunteers, because this person was sitting down with their ballot, could actually talk them through this and say, okay, here in Michigan, winning the state Supreme Court would mean X or Y. And that is just like how it should be. Normatively, like people should be able to like think through their vote and muddy through by party labels or whatever. And I just think this election, even though it was so screwy because of something so terrible, it gave us some insights on how to be better organizers around things like vote by mail and stuff like this. And on the high school question, this is like a thing that's fascinating to me. It's the law in a bunch of states that principals and vice principals are supposed to help their students vote. There is a Georgia code that says that every high school principal is supposed to make it easier for their students to vote. It is like near impossible, evidently, to enforce. But if you wanted to grant me like one little wish, if I could like go inside a Biden administration, it's like no one needs to be the head of the EPA or whatever. They need to have someone who's like in charge of implementing the 1993 National Voter Registration Act. That's how you make a lot of big change. And so at the state level and in the feds, there are laws to do this. It's just not happening.
So, and on that point, Texas also has that law, also one of the lowest levels of turnout and some of the hardest, barriers to registration. North Carolina has this law. I did a survey of high schools to figure out how are they implementing it. Half of them aren't implementing it at all. Of those that are implementing it, it's more likely to happen only in presidential election, or rather than every single year. And so there's incredible variability. And again, a lot of them are implementing it by putting up the table in the cafeteria, and what we need is for teachers to assist, right? Like I want it as part of a curriculum that a voter registration is available, that students can ask questions if they have questions, that it's not just about having a stack of voter registration forms at the principal's office. I think that secondary education, that there is an obligation for us to overcome the registration barrier, and that is much easier in states in which 16-year-olds can pre-register. So that pre-registration becomes this critical thing because you can overlap it in a civics course. It's not about your date of birth relative to the next election, but it's anybody who's the age of 16.
That's right. It is easier to do the voter education and outreach in states where there's pre-registration, but even in progressive California, there's opposition. So I led a project called the Central Valley Freedom Summer in the central conservative part of the state, and alumni members of high schools were not allowed to do nonpartisan voter registration in their own high schools. Their principals did not let them in, even though state law says so. So if we encounter resistance in California, resistance is going to exist elsewhere. And so it's just important to be aware of that and be prepared, armed with the law, to be able to fight any opposition to nonpartisan voter registration.
I want to be mindful. I think we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. I had maybe 2 more questions. The first would be, do we think that the advances that we've made in youth voter registration and then turnout are going to translate into those individuals beginning to run for office more frequently? Do we anticipate that? And so I'd love to just very quickly hear about that and what we think the implications are for that. Veronica. I see your eyebrows going.
In the Central Valley, where I was really deeply engaged in the 2018 election, there's
Sacramento Stockton Girl, so talk to me about this.
a handful of young people who are excited about running for office, for those local offices that they didn't know existed until somewhat recently. They're also inspired by the young mayor of Stockton. There's young city council people, and I think it just creates excitement, a sense of ownership, especially at the local level where it doesn't take as much money to run a campaign. And so I think the more we see young people engaging, the more we'll see younger people running for office.
Ben, I mean, I know you guys are more focused on the registration and the turnout, and sort of the run for somethings of the world are a bit more focused on the what do you do when you want to run. But I'm curious about your thoughts.
Totally. One of the things that's been, I think, so helpful for young people is to have role models, right? Just like we were talking about Mayor Tubbs or Mayor Gorola in Arvin in the Central Valley, we see young people of color who didn't necessarily come from political families or wealthy families or any kind of families saying, okay, my voice matters and I can be a leader, so I'm going to do this. I think we see AOC doing this at the federal level, and it's really helpful. One of the things that's always most interesting to me is who are the young people who are deciding to run for office? And there are, for example, city council seats that are basically all of their constituents are students. Like we'll go to, like Madison, Wisconsin is a great example where there's basically a UW-Madison seat on the city council and the county council. And it used to be like the buttoned up, kind of nerdy college Dems kid who was running for that seat. And like, more power to them, like you do you. Now it's the activists, it's the people with the megaphones, it's the people who are pushing an intersectional youth uprising narrative. And so it's not just whether more young people are going to vote or turn out to run for office, which I think they will. It's which young people, and the ones who want to shake up the system or the ones who interned within the system. It's a huge shift that I've seen really just in the last 3-4 years. And I couldn't be prouder of all the next gen volunteers and former organizers who are running and losing and not giving a crap and running again. That's my kind of person.
I would just add that, of course, I hope that it also motivates a generation of new candidates. But in some ways, I mean, I would also argue that it doesn't necessarily matter, that having young people vote gets the old white guys to follow your interests, right? So that what I ultimately care about is, do young people vote? Do they get their voices heard through the electoral process? Because that's how you influence policy, even if you don't have a young person. North Carolina just elected, right, the youngest member of Congress, and I can guarantee you that he is not going to be the poster child for young voters. So again, it's all about voting and making a choice between that Democrat and Republican, even if it is a very old, white guy.
Well, so thank you. That is like the perfect note on which to end. I just want to say thank you to our panelists for your time and your insights and sharing your perspectives with us. And then, Sarah, am I handing it back over to you, or am I closing out?
You are closing out. Thanks so much, Liz.
All right. Well, to the great University of California, the Institute for Governmental Studies, all my friends at IGS, thank you all so much. Thank you for a great 3 days. Register